back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today we are going to have a bit of an unusual format. With us today is Edward Epstein. He is an American investigative journalist and a professor of political science. He's taught many political science courses at top universities in the US. And he's written a number of books, including the one we will be discussing today, his 2017 book pertaining to Edward Snowden, who many people remember as a whistleblower who exposed the metadata collection program by the NSA, but others point to as an example of a major intelligence, a counterintelligence failure in the United States. And we'll be discussing this in a phone call format rather than our usual video Zoom format. So for those of you who want to listen in the car or while doing something else, you'll now have the opportunity to do so. The book we're discussing is called How America Lost Its Secret, Snowden, the Man and the Theft. When it was first published, it sparked a great deal of controversy because people argued about whether or not it definitively proved that Snowden had been working for the Russian intelligence, as the US government later concluded. But we are going to examine both this work and relevant current events through the lens of the intelligence, not through the lens of the law enforcement, not through the lens of whistleblowers and libertarian arguments about transparency in the intelligence world, but whether or not there is reason to believe that Snowden had connections with the Russians during the months around his leak and what happened afterwards. The reason why this topic is more relevant today is ever before is, first of all, Snowden resurfaced once again from merely giving lectures on security and privacy and secrecy. He is now affiliated with a number of Russian-linked operations, both influence campaigns, political types, covert action, and intelligence operations, and the damage that has been done by his leaks also survives till this day. It has colored the 2014 response to the Russian invasion of Crimea, and it has haunted the US government ever since then. What steps have been undertaken to address the security failures that were uncovered by this incident? We will also examine that as well.
Well, I'd like to ask you, what interested you specifically in Snowden to begin with, and how did you come to a very different perspective from what most analysts were writing at the time?
Well, it was a different perspective from journalism, but not a different perspective from the intelligence services or from the House Intelligence Committee. Or, to put it more simply, it wasn't a different perspective from the investigation by people who actually had access to what damage Snowden had done. The damage assessment, for example, of the NSA, which the House Intelligence Committee had access to, showed that Snowden had taken 1.5 million files. Some of these files had 32,000 pages of documents in them, so a file and a document weren't necessarily the same. Some had PowerPoint presentations, some had photographs. But he took the largest number of files that had been taken from the NSA. So from the point of view of the people I spoke to at the NSA and lesser extent the CIA and FBI, their perspective was that Snowden had stolen a great number of secrets, compromised a huge part of American intelligence, and done enormous damage. Now, you're quite right when you say this was not the current perspective that one would read in the press, because the press was fixed on an issue of whistleblowing, which was considered to be heroic. And, of course, Snowden did whistleblow. He went to Hong Kong, and he met with three journalists there, Laura Poitras, Glenn Greenwald, and Nedita from The Guardian. And he revealed operations of the NSA, which were possibly illegal, and or maybe were definitely illegal, I don't know, but involved domestic surveillance in America and Britain. So it's not like he wasn't a whistleblower. It was that he also compromised U.S. intelligence.
From a communications standpoint, the U.S. government has been extremely ineffective in bypassing this whistleblowing issue, and we've actually seen somewhat similar mishandling later on with Russia's election meddling and other concerns where both domestic and foreign actors were involved in issues, in political issues in the U.S.
Okay, well, let me say... Yes. Yes. Whenever one is dealing with intelligence services, a state actor, in this case Russia or the United States, conversely, is involved. When Snowden went, he took these documents in June 2013, and he flew to Hong Kong. Okay, everyone knows that because he gave a televised press interview in Hong Kong with Glenn Greenwald. So it's very famous that he went to Hong Kong, very well known. But what is less well known is when he went to Hong Kong, he got in touch with Russian diplomats. Now, I use this word diplomats loosely because the way we know he got in touch with Russian diplomats is in September of 2013 at a televised press conference, Vladimir Putin said, I'm going to tell you something that no one knows. He said that Snowden got in touch, I'll use these words, in touch as translation of what Putin said, got in touch with our diplomats in Hong Kong. So, and those diplomats got in touch with me personally, that is me being Putin, and that I then authorized him to come to Russia. So you have something being done clearly by a state actor, by Vladimir Putin, the diplomats in Hong Kong. You know, I mean, he didn't meet a few Russian diplomats in a bar or restaurant. He had to basically have a way of making contact with them, either through the Soviet diplomatic mission in Hong Kong or arranged by a third party or whatever. So he was in touch at the same time. We have two parallel tracks. At the same time that he's doing his highly publicized headline whistleblowing about a domestic operation, or a couple of them, he's also in touch with the Russians and providing them with reason to allow him to go to Russia, a reason clear enough to Putin that he approved it. Now, you ask about the interference in the American election in 2016. Well, the word interference is a pretty broad term. I mean, it involves, say, what's gone on throughout the history of the Cold War and the new Cold War, that Russia will have propaganda, either in Russian newspapers or in friendly newspapers, like many friendly newspapers in the United States and Europe. There are communist papers in France and Italy. And so it's not unheard of for Russia, or I would even say it's common for Russia to try to influence the outcome of elections. And of course, the United States tries to influence the outcome of elections everywhere. Iran, I'm not saying we do it covertly, or that we lie or use false information, but we certainly like elections to come out in a certain direction, and we don't keep it secret. So I wouldn't call interference, if you mean covert interference, which I think you do, then it's something else where they plant documents, false documents, they release information, they steal what's called doxing. But I think in the case of Snowden, it was a very serious intelligence failure. And let me explain. When Snowden took 1.5 million files, whatever he did with them, whether he threw them in the Pacific Ocean, he gave only a small percentage to journalists. Whatever he did with the rest, destroyed the hard drives, as his Hong Kong lawyer says, whatever he did with them, these documents, from a point of view of the NSA and CIA, and British intelligence, by the way, because they were British documents, were compromised because no one could be sure what he did with them. He could say he threw them in the ocean, but he might have given them to the Russians. It's more parallel to what's going on with the documents that Trump, Biden, Pence, and other people have, that once they leave a secure facility, an approved facility, especially documents that are highly compartmentalized, called SCI documents, special compartmentalized information, then they're compromised automatically because no one knows who's seen them and where they've gone. And so what you do with compromised documents is you close down all the sources and methods in them. And our Defense Department had 200 to 300 intelligence officers at different times working around the clock, 7 days a week, going through the documents that Snowden had compromised and closing down all the sources. This was in the year 2013. So when Russia invaded the Ukraine in 2014, and Crimea was part of the Ukraine, we did not have the kind of intelligence that we needed to see this coming or even see how Russia was deploying its troops. In other words, Snowden blinded our entire intelligence service. So this is not a propaganda war. This is an actual intelligence war. So I think that the Snowden case is much different than the disinformation through the media and through Facebook. I think they're two different operations going on.
When I talked to various and assorted people, they all claimed that Snowden first decided to release the information that he did for ideological reasons, and then he sought out Russians due to the fact that his passport was canceled or was about to be canceled, and he needed a safe place to go. However, I'm not inclined to believe that version of the story because it seems to me that a lot of this may have been set up before he got to Hong Kong and before he actually stole those documents. I don't think he could have possibly known what documents to obtain or how to obtain them without external help necessarily. And
Right.
there are other things that were publicized that I found were never quite really explored. For instance, how was he able to obtain 24 passwords from willing, socially engineer 24 passwords from various people he was working with to gain access to all those documents? How did he know which people to ask, and why did they agree to give him passwords and access?
Right. Well, I think everything you say is very interesting, and they're the questions that started me on my investigation. That Snowden's activities could be explained by someone ideologically, and I don't doubt, that Snowden was ideological. Almost all spies, ideological maybe, start out angry at their intelligence service. In other words, they start out annoyed by their superiors or feeling deprived of a job or disagreeing with the, like Kim Philby did, with the ideology of their government, whatever. They start out in that degree, but once they contact an intelligence service, the intelligence service takes over, even though they may not realize it, and grooms them to actually be valuable as an intelligence resource. We see this in Graham Greene's novels like The Human Stain. Going back to your question, when I looked into this question and spoke to people at the FBI and the NSA who were doing the investigation, they quickly veered towards the explanation that he was simply a disgruntled employee. Because otherwise, if they follow the line of reasoning you suggest, they then have to say that there are really intelligence problems, because there's never one mouse. There's never one mole, because if they manage to penetrate an intelligence service, they've obviously used that penetration to expand. So I could find no evidence that he was in touch, even though I looked, with any, and I found suspicious circumstances. I could find no real evidence of any prior contacts he had before the documents, before he took the documents. The absence of evidence doesn't mean the evidence doesn't exist. It's not evidence of absence. It simply means that the investigation that was revealed to me did not find, prior to his leaving the United States, I had no evidence, and so I had to say that. I had suspicions, but not evidence. Now, the interesting thing to me, which goes along with what you're saying about how could he possibly do this himself and know what to take and everything else, is no one has addressed the question, including Snowden in his own book. He doesn't mention it, and he simply says that he never was in touch with the Russians ever, even in Russia, since they never contacted him, which is unbelievable to anyone. That in Putin's Russia, if a man comes who claims to have had access to the deepest secrets of the United States, becomes totally dependent on Putin, needs his sanctuary, needs his support, needs living conditions, wouldn't be briefed on this. But anyway, Snowden's position is he never spoke to Russian intelligence and never gave anything. But we do know that he had some way of contacting Russian diplomats in Hong Kong. And if you've ever tried to contact a diplomat, they simply don't say, oh, hi, and then meet you somewhere. You have to have credentials. And we know that these diplomats, this is all from Putin, we know this, that these diplomats went directly to Putin himself. So they must have been high-level diplomats and most likely high-level intelligence officers that said, we have an American, he wants to come to Russia, he has a great deal of information. Now, how did the Russians know this? If Snowden didn't tell them this, it suggests they had prior information about Snowden. So that itself I find very highly suspicious. Secondly, Snowden did have help in getting from Hong Kong to Russia. Jules Assange provided him with Assange's assistant, flew to Hong Kong and helped him evade security and bought him a ticket and got him onto a Russian airplane in which he flew to Moscow. Now, Snowden's story is that going to Moscow was an accident. He was heading to South America. But he only had a ticket to go to Moscow. And even if he was, he meant to go to South America, he must have known, since he was fairly sophisticated as an intelligence officer. He worked for the CIA before he worked for the NSA. He must have known that if he got to Russia, now being famous for having secrets, the Russians weren't going to let him out, even if he wanted to get out. I mean, you know, the Russians have that power. A transit lounge at an airport is in the sovereign territory of the country. It's not an international area. So and then of course, you know, let me just say, the House Intelligence Committee issued a report on Snowden. Okay. Now this report, the House Intelligence Committee, was led by Adam Schiff. He was the senior member, and we know that Adam Schiff's politics are not in any way right-wing, which is an understatement, obviously. And every member of the House Intelligence Committee signed on to this report. I interviewed the leading members. They all agreed with their assessment, and their assessment was based on them having privileged access. In other words, that all the members had the highest intelligence clearance, and for over a year they met with the relevant officials in the intelligence community, and they came to the conclusion that Snowden had contacts with Russian intelligence officers after he arrived in Russia. Okay, so you know, this is not a Republican or even a conservative analysis. It's a bipartisan committee, and no one has actually contradicted this, and that one even has to ask, you know, 10 years, in June it'll be 10 years since he defected to Russia. 10 years is a longer time than he ever spent working in America for the American government, for Booz Allen, for anyone. In other words, he spent most of his life now in Russia. Now, maybe he supports himself by lecture fees. I don't know. But I did speak to his lawyer in Russia, and his lawyer in Russia told me that he was working for a cybersecurity company. He didn't tell me which one. Of course, he said he couldn't tell me. It was a secret. So in some ways, one has to ask, what has the guy been doing in Russia for 10 years? And of course, he does know enough. He's a smart guy. And he was a buff in intelligence matters, and they very interested in cyber security and cyber penetration and how you send coded messages and everything else. So one would have to think that would Putin allow him to live in Russia and receive the protection of the Russian state if he wasn't assisting them in their current, now war in Ukraine, but a few years ago in their current campaign to affect the elections and affect the outcome of the election in the United States. And I don't see why we have to just talk about the presidential election. You know, many elections are important in the United States, Congress, even state elections. And I'm sure that, you know, Russia, like the United States, is interested in influencing its main adversaries. So,
before we come back to modernity, and I'll explain the reason why I'm interested in Snowden 10 years later, there was something you said struck my interest, which is that you said you had no evidence that he was directly in touch with the Russians before he went to Hong Kong.
I could find them, yes.
But there is a couple of questions that I was battling with for the past 10 years, which is, one, Snowden was a system administrator, network administrator. But at one point, he went to India for an officially sanctioned course on hacking. And so the question was, why India? What was he doing there? And could he have met with someone in India? And the other question was there really any investigation of his border contacts within the U.S. intelligence community? Meaning, could his contacts in the U.S. have themselves been compromised? Even if he didn't meet directly with the Russians, could he have been meeting with other assets who were already implanted in the intelligence community?
Yes, I'm aware of the suspicious activities of Edward Snowden prior to his defection to Russia. He waved a flag, as I say in my book, saying, I'm a disgruntled employee. He told people in Japan, when he said there that the NSA was doing things wrong. In India, it was fairly suspicious, and he could easily have been spotted by Russian intelligence. On his various communication platforms on Ars Technica message, he said, so if the Russians were looking for someone vulnerable to being recruited, I'm not saying they were, and we don't know how good they are at this or anything else. Certainly they would have not missed Snowden. When I went to Hawaii, I went to the place where Snowden talked to a group of, let's call them anti-NSA people. There are people, a lot of people in America do not like surveillance, and they don't like the idea that the NSA does surveillance, okay? And they don't like the idea that Google does surveillance either. They like privacy, okay? And Snowden addressed a group of about 25 of them, using his name, Edward Snowden. He didn't hide it. He didn't hide his identity, and he explained to them how they could use what's called Tor technology, which is a way of evading having your messages traced back to you. It stands for the onion router, T-O-R. So during this discussion, I found a number of people who attended his lecture. And in the lecture, he said that about half the people that he works with objected to the NSA's surveillance. And he talked about it. And so, it's not like he was keeping his dissidents a secret. He was pretty outspoken about it. And once he got in touch with Laura Poitras, who knew Glenn Greenwald and the other people involved from a foundation or a little security group they worked at in New York. He communicated with them, making it clear that he was willing to take information from the NSA and give it to them. So they tried to be very secure. They used air-gapped computers. That's what Laura Poitras says in her book and film. But the Russians have ways of breaching amateur security, and so for that matter, to the Chinese and the CIA. And so one wonders, forgetting the Russians, forgetting the Chinese, why didn't the NSA or CIA catch on to this guy for all the reasons that you just mentioned? His trip to India and his outspokenness against the NSA in Hawaii, and his telling someone in Japan that he had a way of defeating the security system of the NSA and things like that. Why? So there's obviously a failure in American intelligence, and that's why, you know, it wasn't just Snowden. If our system had fairly good security, he never would have become so obvious that he was a disgruntled employee willing to expose information. So, but what I was talking about was, when I said there was no evidence, is I couldn't find any evidence that he met or had been recruited or knew any enemy intelligence agents. That's all I meant. That I couldn't find any, but of course, one often doesn't find intelligence trails. The intelligence services hide their trails.
Well, I'm getting at something a little more disturbing than just extreme negligence and incompetence by people who should have known better, which is that he may have had assistance. In other words, what if one of his bosses was sympathetic to his views or in some ways involved in covering up his trail? Was it possible that there were other higher placed moles inside the intelligence and that Snowden was merely kind of a spokesperson for them, a public face to that activity within the NSA, who may have been not in line with the surveillance program specifically or with the organization in general, or who were being paid by a foreign state actor and who had reasons to facilitate his advances without stopping him when they could.
Right. Well, if we want to get into the realm of possibilities, there could have been a high level or mole in the NSA supplying Russia with information, and they used Snowden as a sacrificial lamb, let him go public and then let him flee to Russia to hide other information that someone was providing, and Snowden might not even know about this other person. But, so there are many possibilities in the case of the penetration of the NSA, but this was a major penetration of American intelligence. The documents he took, the NSA was setting up with the Department of Defense, or had just set up recently, something called the Cyber Command. Okay, and he took 800,000 documents of the Cyber Command. These are documents that told about our defenses against penetration of our computers, and not only intelligence computers, but Facebook and everything else. So, we were building defenses against some country manipulating our the entire cyber world, let's call it, okay? And that's one of the things that went missing. And so if Russia got it, or if North Korea got it, or if China got it, or even a mafia group got it, they would basically have a huge amount of information about our defense system. One of the things that Snowden took, we know this, that Rick Leggett, who's the deputy director of the NSA, and he also did the damage assessment, and he stated this before the House committee, okay, and publicly. Snowden took one 32,000-page document which talked about every agency of government we have, I don't know, something like 16 intelligence services, from Coast Guard to CIA to Defense, DIA, FBI. They all reported to the NSA what gaps there were in their intelligence gathering. So the FBI would say, we can't get information from North Korea or from this particular source. So this report was a compilation of all the intelligence services saying what the gaps in their attempts to get intelligence actually is from Russia and China and North Korea, 3 countries. This document being missing meant that if no one knows where it is or what Snowden did with it, I mean, Snowden has lied about everything that would connect him to transferring intelligence to anyone other than journalists. But in any case, we don't know where it is. And so if it was in the hands of an adversary, they would know what the gaps were, and they could use those gaps to do whatever they wanted to. And so, I think that the question of whether they had recruited Snowden, then the issue comes up, well, why blow someone you've recruited, which, I mean, if he was supplying them with information prior to his going public, they wouldn't have wanted him to go public. I'm just talking now. I don't know the thinking of Russia. But in all the intelligence people I've spoken to, if you have someone in place and they're providing you with information, the last thing you want them to do is expose themselves. That would be one argument that he was not under Russian control, because they never would have allowed him to do what he did. On the other hand, they might have felt that he was already blown, or that they were using him as, I mentioned, a pawn, a sacrificial piece, to protect other people they had. So, but I can only say, what I found. I can also say what the intelligence committees found, and I spoke to officials at the intelligence services, but I can't assume they would tell me very much. And no one found that Snowden had any contacts with foreign intelligence services. Okay. Now, getting back to your question, did he have help? He must have had help, because at the time he was using his computer to transfer information, he didn't have access to the compartmentalized information, to the compartments that he was breaching. So either it was total incompetence, which some people at the NSA argue it was, or someone allowed him to do this, or they just were. So he couldn't have done this, let me put it this way, following the rules of the NSA, an outside contractor, which is what Snowden was. He worked for Booz Allen. He couldn't have had access to some of the information that he took. So he must have had help, whether it was inadvertent help, people just acted irresponsibly, which happens all the time, or whether it was help by another penetration into the NSA. We don't know. I don't know, at least.
Well, I have to say that even if he was blown, and that generally is not in the interest of the intelligence services, Russia and others did get a lot out of the embarrassment, the public embarrassment that happened afterwards. And what's more importantly, if someone in the intelligence services there was playing a long game, they created significant distrust for the U.S. government, the sympathy for the Snowden types, and a sense of disbelief for future communications by the intelligence community that could have served many future operations well. And indeed, we are seeing a lot of the similar steps of massive leaks of data and massive internal political wrangling over the agendas in those leaks that have happened afterwards. And frankly, as far as I see, the Snowden was a test run for the success of such operations. Yes. And it succeeded. It built internal political climate that made other things possible, at the very least. But yes. I wanted to get back to
right. Mm-hmm. What you say is true. Okay, that the Snowden's public expose through the Guardian newspaper to television, as you say, demoralized American intelligence, raised inhibitions to them doing certain things they have been doing, including on the war on terrorism, affected our relations with allies like Israel, which now felt that if there was a leak or penetration in American intelligence, they couldn't turn over certain information. So it did a lot of damage, just the fact of a revelation. And there are precedents for intelligence services blowing agents on purpose in order to get public exposure. The most famous case happened after World War I in the early 1920s. There was a huge Russian deception operation called the Trust. And when it lost it led to the capture of many Western intelligence officers in Russia. It was one of the communists' first big successes. But at a certain point, they decided that they were it was no longer producing valuable information for them, so they decided to blow it themselves by having the head of the trust give a newspaper interview. His name was Appleput. Give a newspaper interview explaining how they had deceived and duped British and American and French intelligence, which led to the kind of demoralization you're talking about. So when an intelligence operation is about to be concluded, or say in the case of Penkovsky, when he's captured, then the other service tries to get maximum public exposure by blowing the agent and trying to demoralize it. So that does happen. So, it's not like 100%. You can't say anyone that goes public can't have ever been, can't have formerly been a spy. It could have been. I'm just saying that if he was a productive spy, they would have to have balanced losing him as a productive spy, which is a spy in place, of course, as opposed to the demoralization and that they were gained by the kind of event that happened in Hong Kong. But as I say, you're asking me to speculate, and I tried as hard as I could to find a trail for him prior to his defection. And I did find that once he contacted Laura Poitras, he did act in a very conspiratorial way, having her set up a dead drop for him to supply documents, and he seemed to know exactly what he was doing. And he delivered the information and organized the press conference. He orchestrated everything. And so someone else may well have told him what to do. But I never found that other person, or even that the other person existed.
And to your knowledge, has there been any internal inquiry inside the NSA or other agencies into any potential accomplices?
Well, one of the things, one of the people I knew quite well in American intelligence was James Jesus Angleton, who more or less created the counterintelligence service. And what Angleton found was that the tendency of any intelligence gathering organization, let's say the Russian division of the CIA, would try to hide any evidence that they had been penetrated, because it would mean their jobs and their careers. So what Angleton, as we're talking about after Philby in the 1960s, okay, Angleton told Alan Dulles and the directors of the CIA, we have to set up counterintelligence at the level of the director, a staff, not at the level of the actual intelligence gathering. So his point was that an intelligence service hides any penetrations or misconduct inside itself. The same could be said of a newspaper. You know, a newspaper does not like to expose that one of its reporters is on the payroll of, let's say, some pharmaceutical company, because it calls the whole newspaper into disrepute. They would, of course, fire the reporter, and they would have a kind of investigation. But so it's not, you don't have a sort of objective fact-finding. Did Snowden have assistance or not? The immediate reaction within, first of all, let's say Booz Allen, because Booz Allen was the outside contractor, and Booz Allen itself has had not merely Snowden, but had two other contractors who stole information from the NSA. So Booz Allen's immediate reaction would be, Snowden did it alone. He was an outlier rather than there's a systematic failure, because they, had their billion-dollar contracts with American intelligence. Okay. Secondly, the NSA acts exactly like Booz Allen acts. They had much evidence. For example, there was evidence that Snowden had forged his exam to try to get into the NSA. He was an outside contractor. He wanted to actually be an employee of the NSA, which could be evidence of someone trying to penetrate the NSA, get a job. And somehow he forged the answers on the exam. They knew that. But they didn't then ban him from working for Booz Allen. They just more or less covered that up. So I think, I've investigated a number of intelligence failures, let's call them. And it's very hard to find evidence of a successful Russian or Chinese or whatever, Cuban penetration, because the natural tendency of those involved in the case is to hide the fact that it went on for several years, or went on for or involved others. I have a short book on James Angleton called James Angleton, Was He Right? And in the book, I go through at the end of a number of CIA recruits, people, Russian diplomats who supposedly were working for the CIA. And their information was very important and was being passed on to the president. And what they found is, after they discovered that these people were double agents, so they were actually working not for the CIA but for Russia and only pretending to work for the CIA, when they found that, rather than reviewing it and going back and looking at all the fake information they gave, the CIA itself hid the fact that they had been supplying the president and the Secretary of Defense with fake information. So I think inside an organization, organizations do not like to investigate themselves. They do not like to say they're corrupt. So it's not an easy task.
So is that possible that to this day, if there were some additional insiders, they still might be operational?
Yes, it's possible. If there was one, 10 years, there were a number of agents like Robert Hansen and Alder James who lifetime service was longer than 10 years. So yes, if the Russians had a successful penetration of the NSA, and they had one historically, like Jack Dunlap, but they had a present one at the time of Snowden in 2013, and they used Snowden to hide his existence. We're now in 2023. Yeah, it's certainly possible a person would still be there, maybe even promoted to a higher level.
So the reason all of this surfaced in my mind 10 years after the chain of events is that Snowden, unlike many of his predecessors who fled to another country, is not just merely sitting there and teaching courses to whoever, but he's been very active operationally publicly. He's been known to be connected to Kaspersky, which is in itself a cyber firm connected to the FSB, and he's also been connected to a cryptocurrency project that is known to be funding separatists in Spain and other countries that are backed by Russia. So, unlike previous sort of spies who faded into the background and kept a low profile, Snowden is very much still being used very actively, and not just as a propagandist, but as someone as face of significant operations. And my question is, why would that be? Why would someone like him continue to be active and known when his identity has been blown, and when he's clearly linked to the Russian intelligence now, whatever may have been the case previously?
Well, when my book came out in 2017, I was attacked in the New York Times for being, as the reviewer called it, obsessed with Russia. Because I made a big deal out of the fact that he had defected to Russia, like Philby had defected to Russia, like Burgess, like McLean. And so I was attacked for being, if my book had come out a year later after Donald Trump had been president and the media had suddenly turned against Russia, no one could have said that because the media were so Russian obsessed, which they still are, by the way. But I think the answer is very simple, at least in the media, and I think also in the government. A narrative is established. When that narrative is established, it's like a huge iceberg floating it's very hard to change its course. I mean, and people just go back, journalists have their clip file, they go back and say, but this journalist said this one said that. So what happened is Snowden very successfully established a narrative that he was a heroic person sacrificing his own freedom, which he didn't do, by the way. He went to Russia, like Philby did. It's not sacrificing your freedom to defect to another country, but sacrificing his freedom in order to help the public of America and England, because he exposed a lot of British activities too. And once that narrative got established, newspapers like The Guardian and the New York Times, New York Review of Books, Nation magazine, he gave them interviews while he was still in Moscow. Their reporters spoke to him, or actually went over and visited him, spent time with him, and that narrative became shielded in Teflon. And so, I was attacked for basically attacking their narrative. And I think that happens a great deal in journalism, that it takes a lot to crack a narrative once it becomes the established narrative.
The reason I'm so curious about all of these events is that there's evidence that Snowden is linked to building up other operations that are no less damaging than his own activity back in the day, albeit perhaps in different ways. He is linked to various platforms that are alleged to specialize in digital rights, but have their impact has been to cover for Russian disinformation operations and Russian funding of operations. And Snowden has...
Let's take the United States, for example. This is to get to Russia. In the United States, many Russians defect to the United States. Okay? They come over from Russian GRU, FSB, KGB. They defect to the United States. One could easily name a dozen or so. When they get to the United States, the CIA has a special branch that takes charge of them. And then they are exploited. Now, what exploited means is arranged to write books, to give newspaper interviews, to contact organizations. They're used by our intelligence services assuming that all the information from them has been milked out, they're now used in the public media to serve in the let's call it the propaganda war. So we could assume that Russia does the same. So when someone defects, whether it's Snowden or Philby, the person is now used once he's milked of whatever information he may possess, and whatever his skills are used by their intelligence services. He's then used and paid for his use and used to advance their propaganda interests. So I don't find it unusual. Look, I mean, Snowden comes to Russia, his credit cards are canceled, he doesn't have a penny. This is June 2013. He has to live, he needs an apartment, he has a girlfriend who he then marries and has a child with. He writes a book, but the CIA tries to seize all the earnings from the book, so I doubt he got very much. I'm not sure about that. The movie that Oliver Stone made paid his lawyer, Kucherina, but didn't pay Snowden. So for 10 years, how has Snowden supported himself? He supported the answer. Well, first of all, I don't know. I spoke to Kucherina about it, and Kucherina wouldn't tell me. He said he had a job, okay? But whatever it is, he's earning money in Russia for doing something that is not against the Russian interest. And so the types of things you cite seem to be totally consistent with how you would handle a defector in any country in the world, including the United States or Russia or China. You try to get maximum value, since now you have to pay for his upkeep.
What do you think would it take to unravel the Snowden myth and to reveal the damage that Russian disinformation, aided by actors like him, is currently doing to the international community?
Okay. Well, the House Intelligence Report came out in 2016 and 2017. It was, as I said, a bipartisan report. Well, they spent over a year on it, and they had access to something the media, including myself, by the way, could not possibly have access to, and that is the damage assessment reports done by all the intelligence services. That report has it did not receive a single story other than it was released on the day it was released. So the media isn't interested in exposing the damage Snowden did. And the American government isn't interested in it because it makes the American government look foolish. And it also raises a major question, which I tried to raise, and that is the American government outsources a great deal of its intelligence analysis to private contractors like Booz Allen. Now, these companies have different levels of security than actually the American, than the NSA has or the CIA has. So what Snowden pointed to, and two other people like Snowden pointed to, was that the entire system, why does it outsource the analysis of its top secrets? And the answer is budget. That Congress gives a certain budget and it keeps cutting the intelligence budget. But one way around congressional appropriations is for them to contract to pay a contractor to do the work, because that goes under a separate budget that the president can authorize, and it can be authorized within the budget without having the same level of congressional scrutiny. So to answer your question, no one is really interested in exposing major defects and deficiencies, including penetrations of American intelligence.
But meanwhile, the impact continues to grow and become even more damaging. And we're not even talking about the operations that were compromised back in the day. We're talking about the ongoing impact today that is current, that started with the war in Ukraine and the lacking intelligence, and the impact it has on other propaganda issues, on other tensions with allies, other cyber operations, other disinformation campaigns, all of that generated from the information from Snowden, facilitated by Snowden himself currently, and also by the potential vulnerabilities that continue to be exploited, possibly the same operatives being in place and so on and so forth. Basically, not only nothing has been fixed, but it's actually been exploited more and compounded by other issues. So what?
Right.
So,
Look, it's an embarrassment to the media that their great hero, Edward Snowden, is still in Moscow and I just sought and received Russian citizenship, which probably qualifies him for the Russian military. In any case, and Russia is now engaged in a war against freedom in the Ukraine. This is an embarrassment. And so the easiest way to deal with an embarrassment is not to mention it. Have you seen any articles, whatever happened to Edward Snowden or what's he doing in Russia? None. And the basic response to my book and to was that, look, he made a mistake, I made a mistake here or there, and I did, there are mistakes any author makes, and I did make some minor mistake. And from there they go on to, say that this is all fake news and this is untrue, and they go back to their narrative, and they stop thinking about it. No one thinks about, except for you, no one thinks about Snowden anymore. And people ask me when I meet people at dinners or things, they say, have you seen Snowden recently? As if he's in New York. I said, no, he's in Moscow. And they look at me dumbfounded.
Apologies, my call dropped. You were saying that,
Well, what I'm saying is that in the American public, remember Snowden as a hero that they saw on television. And they assume that he either came back to the United States or that or they don't think about it. That no one, it's an embarrassment in the middle of the Ukraine war that Snowden in Moscow under the protection of Putin. And as I said earlier, I have for this is my book. In 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea on the Ukraine, the Wall Street Journal reported a very good piece that our NSA was completely blind to the invasion that our eyes and ears observe, our intelligence gathering. The Russians somehow managed to invade everything. And they think that 6 months earlier, roughly 6 months earlier, Snowden had given up the keys to the kingdom, which would allow them to evade our intelligence system. And now, 10 years have passed, and intelligence services had to close down their sources in 2013. And presumably and hopefully they found new sources and new methods in those 10 years. We hope so. And we have better intelligence now. But the loss, intelligence officials said publicly that we lost a generation of our intelligence capabilities, which would be 20 years. So I don't know, but certainly Snowden has not helped our position or the Ukraine's position in terms of intelligence gathering.
And ironically, the same methods are being used now to try to discredit any assistance Ukraine may be getting from NATO by the same suspects. And it sounds like the damage has gone, has not only been intelligence but also political, which only reinforces the intelligence damage.
Right. And if you look at triumphs for Russia in the intelligence war, you could find very few. I mean, Philby goes back to the 1950s, okay? Burgess, McLean. There have been a few, a guy called Edward Howard defected to Russia, a few minor. So Snowden was a great brother in their camp, that an American who had access to the NSA was able, according to America, take 1.5 billion files. Decides to live in Moscow and work in Moscow. It was a triumph, and for Putin. When Obama asked Putin to return him, Putin just laughed at him and said no. And Obama reacted by calling off the two-man summit in 2013, but that was a total reaction to research. So America wanted a lot better relations with Russia. And so, up until even when Russia seized the Crimea in 2014, our sanctions were limited against Russia. The case still was supplying oil, energy, steel, magnesium, aluminum, and even today, says things are exempt from sanctions, including oil, and including steel, including titanium. So we still are, I wouldn't say half-hearted, but we're only now coming around to seeing Russia as an adversary.
But the fact that we are overlooking still to this day Russia's disinformation and information warfare efforts, that makes future Snowdens more likely, especially when they're glorified and when the ideological uprooting of key principles that would have downplayed the likes of Snowden in the past is allowed to take root across society.
Well, I don't know about it's hard to judge the propaganda war. I tend to think it's overestimated, that the Russian propaganda had very little effect on the American 2016 election. That's my own opinion. I'm more interested in the substantive destruction of the capabilities of American intelligence to look inside Russia and see what they're developing. Other people are much better on the subject of, how much damage is done by misinformation and propaganda in the public sphere. Maybe a great deal, but I don't know very much about that.
Has there been any effort to restore U.S. capabilities and restructure things? I mean, so far I'm not seeing anything, and yes, we've got some intelligence right on the start of the war, but overall, from everything I hear, our capabilities have been erased not just by Snowden, by subsequent mistakes and the hiring process and all sorts of other issues from within.
Well, you say we had intelligence about the start of the war, which is true, but the Russians didn't hide. I mean, they, had 150,000 troops mobilized, marching up and down the border. It was on Russian television and everything else. So it didn't take, a fall to reveal this great penetration, unlike the way they operated in 2014, where they just suddenly took over the Crimea, and that the humans were green men who claimed to be volunteers or whatever they were. we were more successful in 2022 in seeing what they were not trying to hide. In fact, I think that they were trying to make it clear to us in the hope that concessions would be obtained simply through mobilization of the troops and things of that sort. But in any case, I think that our military intelligence in the Ukraine is probably pretty good. Our overhead reconnaissance, our satellites, our AWAC planes of flight. I think the military intelligence is always very good because the Russians, troops, and maybe all troops now, I don't know, have cell phones, which change everything of war because they can detect where they are by their cell phones. And you know, up until 2000, no one had a mobile phone that told where they were. And, you know, even if you turn your phone off, it can be detected, you know, so, and the Russians don't turn their phones off. I don't know about troops. They turn their phones off with Ukrainian troops. I think Ukraine, you know, everyone has a cell phone now in the world. So, you know, but I think military intelligence, because it has specific objectives, like where are the Russian munitions stored. And they're pretty good at finding that, or where is a ship sailing, or where do the pipelines went. I think that the kind of intelligence that the NSA was producing up to Snowden was intelligence that Russia couldn't expect we were obtaining through the interception of coded phone calls and enciphered messages, stuff of that sort. So I think that, you know, that there was a huge loss in 2014 because they, well, we had to close down all our sources and methods, and I would assume, maybe wrongly, but I assume that having Russia in the palm of their hand for 10 years, they became quite familiar with what our intelligence capabilities were up to 2013.
And of course, if the whole situation has not been cleared out and there were any other, you know, insiders, then they might still be very well familiar with our, at least civilian intelligence to this day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also another thing that a defector can give, any defector, Russia defected to America, America defected to Russia, which are make you, he can name other people that he met in his service at either Booz Allen or the NSA who are disgruntled and angry at what the NSA does. So a defector can identify people to be approached. So, you know, I mean, I think Snowden did know other people and knew how loyal or disloyal they might be.
One last question, because I don't want to take too much of your time, but that it goes back to you mentioned about the angry anti-NSA people, supporters of the Tor project, and people Snowden was teaching about how to evade surveillance or the dangers of surveillance and so on and so forth. How many of those people do you think would have been, do you think some of them could have been potential targets for the Russians or other foreign intelligence as well? People who were not strictly speaking part of the intelligence community, but who were sort of involved on the outer spheres and sympathetic to ideologically.
Now, I think the people that Snowden contacted were not in any way spies. I think he contacted people, Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald, because they were demonstrated that they were sympathetic to his view and very concerned about American surveillance. He picked people that could be helpful to him because he knew that they would resonate with what he was offering them. So I don't think they had to be in any way connected, and they weren't being connected with any intelligence service. They were people he used to get his to perform what he was performing, and that is make himself into a hero. So they went over to Hong Kong. They saw a huge scoop. They saw the opportunity. A huge scoop would afford them of advancing their sincere interest, which was defeating the NSA and defeating American surveillance of Americans. Very certain that. And so they saw Snowden as useful. Snowden saw them as useful.
Well, I do find it ironic that Glenn Greenwald echoes a lot of the Russian talking points now, whether that's a coincidence or not, that's, a matter of...
Right. Well, things happen, and people are often used without them knowing who's using them for what purpose. And I think that the true genius of an intelligence service, when the FSB, SBR, CIA, MI6, is being able to use people without them knowing that they're being used.
Would you say that the Snowden, or the way the Snowden operation was handled, is in any way similar to what happened with Oswald?
What happened with who?
With Oswald.
I'll go on. Well, both defected to Russia. Oswald was a U.S. Marine discharged for parade, dishonorably, whenever, maybe not dishonorably, but discharged. And, Snowden had been in the American military. I think Snowden got some sort of impaired discharge. So there were parallels. Both were disgruntled with American society. Oswald was totally uneducated and unconnected. Snowden was self-educated but well-connected. He had family members who were admirals and things like that. Oswald had some access to secrets. He worked at a YouTube base. He said he did. He said he had access to secret both of us. He also had a press conference in Moscow. Had a journalist, Priscilla Johnson, write about why he defected like stuff. So there are some similarities. But I think, that Snowden was a very different case because Oswald was perceived by the media, correctly, by the way, as being an assassin. With Aiden Frigate was Snowden was perceived as being a hero and a courageous whistleblower. So they were perceived totally differently. And, of course, Snowden did what he wanted to do, and that is damage the NSA. And damage especially the NSA's domestic spying programs, which he succeeded in doing. And maybe it's good that he did it, not bad. And it's, of course, whether that was his prime objective, or whether his prime objective was actually getting to another country, which he had talked about a good deal. Of course, the other country he talked about was China, with threats and things like that. But whether he wound up in Russia because there was the only place to go, or planned to go, I don't know. But yeah, I think there were some similarities with Oswald's defection, but Oswald came back to America after like 2 years. Well, the rest let him go back, but they'll never let Snowden go back to America.
No, I can't imagine. But unfortunately, in both cases, the way this insularity, this self-preservation instincts of the intelligence community have led to incorrect perceptions and misunderstanding of the adversary by the general public.
Well, I spoke to a number of top KGB officers in Moscow. I was able to put it, Alder James, Robert Hansen. And they told me, I think quite frankly, that what they look for is a disgruntled employee. Okay. Once a disgruntled employee initially doesn't have any idea that he's being approached or recruited by a foreign intelligence service. He just finds a sympathetic person. And then gradually, incrementally, slice by slice, he is slowly made to do their bidding. And in such a way, it maybe at the end of the day, he never realizes that he was ever manipulated by head of intelligence service. They're very good at basically finding disgruntled employees. And disgruntled employees we can find by either having another defector who tells you who the disgruntled employee is, or simply following the behavior, let's say, on the internet of a number of likely possible candidates. See what they write each other. So, but what I said before, intelligence services, it's not like in the movies where they go to someone and show pictures of some compromised activity and say, now you're a man. It's a much slower, incremental process of which the target is rarely aware of even who he's working for.
Well, thank you so much for these wonderful insights, and
thank you, Irina. It's very nice speaking to you.
Wow. And so this was the program discussing in detail Edward Epstein's book, one of the few of its kinds that are looking at Snowden not as a public figure, but from the position of security failures in the US, from the position of his impact on the US intelligence, and from the position of his connections to Russia then and now. And we are looking at also whether Snowden was a modern day Lee Harvey Oswald, or was he another type of actor? And we will see more of such people thanks to his example and thanks to the public response to what happened. Thank you for everyone who joined us today for this controversial but extremely relevant topic. We will be back next Tuesday at our usual time, 9 p.m. Thank you for watching. This was the Washington Outsider Report with Irina Zuckerman, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider on the Coalition Radio. And thank you and have a good night.